Go.
Wow, this is an exciting one. Let's head straight on to our next session, powered by Markettiers, which is a live version of our Fuse podcast. I'd like to welcome on stage our Fuse podcast host, Adrian Marr, founder and partner at Fan Club PR. And Adrian is joined by Anjali Bedi, founder of Boon, and they are going to discuss the psychology of influence, navigating disinformation in the AI age. Welcome both.
Hey! Thank you very much. I should point out to the audience that this is a simultaneous podcast recording, so any heckling or swearing will be caught on here. This is powered by Markettiers. Thank you very much, Daniel. The topic we're tackling today is probably one of the most urgent topics of our time, that of disinformation. This isn't just about the odd bit of fake news. This is about weaponizing communications that has the potential to undermine democracy, polarize society, and damage brands. Joining me here is Anjali Bedi. Anjali, I've met a few times and always come away feeling a bit smarter, but also a little bit more stupid because she is so damn clever. Anjali is the founder of Boon. Before that, she was a global head of behavioral psychometrics at a small little agency called Edelman. And she built Edelman's first ever disinformation offer. And you built that to combat human trafficking. Maybe we could start there. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely, we can start there. So actually, we built the disinformation offer in January 2021. And if we remember what was going on at the time, or if it's purposeful amnesia, which I think I definitely suffer from that time, it was COVID, it was lockdown. And if you looked at any data at that time, it would tell you that everybody was wearing masks, socially distancing, and following all the rules. We all know that is nonsense, especially for the United States, which, as you can tell from my accents, I'm not from the UK, I'm originally from the US. And so we built that disinformation offer at the time because we were observing a increasingly horrific trend, which was the level and the rate at which narratives were being weaponized against brands, whether it was Pfizer for obvious reasons, or anybody in the pharma space, or even brands like HP. So everybody was facing disinformation in varying forms, and especially this sort of a reactiveness against these wonderful things called facts. That sort of extended to a lot of the work that I had done in the human trafficking space, which I was based in Singapore for a number of years. And if you're familiar with human trafficking, over 60% of global victims are sourced from the Asia-Pacific region and taken to places like the UK, like Australia, the US, and so on. And from what we were doing from a data perspective at that time was a lot of trying to understand how do we build resilience into vulnerable communities? And how do we make sure that, especially when we're trying to sort of mitigate the harm towards survivors, that we're identifying what are the narratives that we need to leverage to be able to build resilience into vulnerable communities, especially at a time where QAnon, for example, was weaponizing narratives around human trafficking, and certain members of the Democratic Party, for example, were evil child traffickers, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, no facts sort of related to that, but it's a very sticky and spreadable narrative to use. Certainly Epstein, similar sort of situation. So it's the confluence of those two things that really kind of came together to build that disinformation offer, and certainly something that I think is incredibly relevant just given the spreadability of disinformation that we have.
Cool. And before we go any further, just to be very, very clear about this, what is the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Amazing question. Misinformation is narratives and fake narratives that are spread mistakenly. Probably every single person is guilty of spreading misinformation at some point. I know I certainly am. Disinformation is quite different, though, and it comes down to intent. Disinformation is fake information that is shared with the intent to create harm in some form, whether it is to undermine your opponent or a competitor, whether it's intended to destabilize society or democracy. Intent is really the key thing to look at.
Right. And we saw this in play last summer. Just after the Southport stabbings, there was some disinformation that spread about the person who committed that being a Muslim. which wasn't the case, but it also, led to the riots that happened last summer as well. How bad can this get? Take us there. Give us some examples of what's been happening.
Well, we are living the outcome of 20 years of coordinated disinformation attacks. This is not a new thing. We are literally living it in real time. Brexit, what we are currently seeing in the US, which continues to get worse. Also, what we're seeing in the UK. It is not an accident these things are happening. This is literally a coordinated attempt to destabilize our societies, and we've seen that over time. The narratives change, the actors spreading those narratives have changed, the specific channels used to spread them have changed, but we are literally living the shockwaves of that. And it does continue to get worse, and it can get much worse, because if you look at, let's say, just the conflicts of the last year, whether we're looking at Israel-Palestine or India-Pakistan, Russia and Ukraine, even the rate at which disinformation is being spread in the Donbas region right now against Ukrainians and using Telegram as a means to do that, it will take us to a point where, A, we don't know what's actually happening anywhere. Therefore, how are we supposed to react to it? What do we take to be truth? What is the source of truth? And in doing that, it not only creates additional fissures and fractures in society that are very easy to exploit, but also immobilize us as well. So you have examples like that, or even election interference, another terrific and also horrific example, because we're literally talking about the foundations of our democracies eroding in real time. This is sort of a trite example, but a relevant one. I don't know if there's any Taylor Swift fans in the room. Yeah, okay, great. But Swifties for Trump. A perfect example of disinformation being spread of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this example, but Taylor Swift had come out in support of Kamala Harris. There were a range of different attack narratives, different from disinformation narratives, by the way, but attack narratives, criticizing her for being a cat lady who hopefully loves that Haitians are going to come kidnap her cats. So it's another sort of can of worms to delve into, of course. But on the other side, it was disinformation narrative saying that Taylor Swift had actually come out in support of Donald Trump, which, of course, she had not. And so that, in and of itself, when you have either fake narratives or now even more concerningly with deep fakes, stating that a certain individual or a certain influencer in society is coming out in support of something, and you have millions of their fans following them, that is, of course, incredibly dangerous. So I think we are at the tip of the iceberg, actually, at how bad this can get because of generative AI as well, and also because of agentive. It just enhances the spreadability, the scalability, and the ability to turn around narratives almost in real time that you know will resonate and that you know are sticky. So that's the ecosystem, that's the environment we're in.
Can we just dig into that a little bit? Because I think the generative and agentic together offers like a huge potential for danger. Can you explain to our audience a little bit about how those two work together to weaponize communications at a mass scale?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've focused a lot on social media when we look at, let's say, the spreadability of disinformation. And that's a channel. In the end, what really matters is who are the people that you're actually connecting to, or the groups of people that you're connecting to across a really broad range of channels. And obviously, the more varied, the more troublesome, especially if you're combating disinformation. But it's also the generation of content, where I think for everybody who works in the PR and public affairs space, you're familiar with the content creation process. It used to take a lot more time than it does now. And if you have, let's say, somebody sitting in a room generating hundreds of pieces of content a day using generative AI, making a few minor tweaks, and then knowing exactly who to share it with and what's going to resonate, it becomes a lot harder to fight this because of the scalability of it. So it's not the technologies in themselves that are actually the challenge. It's how those are being leveraged and weaponized. But it also provides an opportunity as well, of course, because it doesn't mean we're purely a victim of the technology. Technology is inherently neutral. It also then depends on how we choose to use that technology to be able to combat this. And that's a whole other side of the entire disinformation conversation.
Earlier today, we had Simon from the Government Communication Service come up on stage and talk about the role of social media in dividing people. Why aren't social media firms doing more to combat the problems that disinformation creates?
It's a great question. And I think to start with, most of the social platforms kind of used to operate with a very Silicon Valley ethos, which was sort of freedom of information, open platforms. And I think what we've seen over the years is that doesn't necessarily work, because when you scale human connection, you also unfortunately scale human problems. And we can be slightly problematic in certain ways, which is perhaps another long conversation to delve into. But part of the challenge is that for most of the social platforms, their business models, of course, on the basis of views and how long people actually stay on those platforms and the amount of content that they're watching in any given time. I actually used to work in the content curation space for a regional Netflix competitor in Asia. And it's the exact same metrics that we use in the content curation space to get people to watch more that, of course, the social platforms are using as their performance metrics. Now, all the platforms have they used to have big safety teams before a couple of years ago, but they used to have pretty sizable safety teams that did some phenomenal work. And I actually had the pleasure of working with a lot of those teams during my counter-human trafficking days, because all of them are looking at how do we fight things like bullying on the platform, how do we enable suicide prevention, reduce levels of depression, child grooming. There's all sorts of criminality that happens on those platforms that are incredibly difficult to combat. So all of those teams were constantly in firefighting mode, trying to figure out how do we actually react to this? And what are the policies that we put in place that both enable the values of the company, but also that enable safety on those platforms? I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the blasphemy law in Pakistan that was passed like 10, 15 years ago. Actually, no, it was less than that now. It was about 10 years ago, which was a law essentially that was used to target ultimately religious minorities, not by the government, but by local people. And Facebook saw a really high rate of people using the platform to target certain minorities. And there was a big call from the NGO community in Pakistan at the time to, hey, you need to flag this content, take it down. But for them, it violated their free speech principles. And this used to be something that got discussed at all the safety conferences every year, because again, it's wonderful to have that principle of freedom of speech, but you also then need to protect people on the ground. And those two things living side by side can be incredibly difficult sometimes. Same thing goes, so many examples from the 2016 election in the US as well, where Facebook in particular was weaponized against local populations. So I clearly can go on about this for days. I will refrain from doing that, but essentially there are ways from a curation perspective that you could actually solve for this, but we're at a point now where the algorithmic silos are so deep that you almost have to walk people back from the edge to a certain extent, get them to start to see different types of content and start to accept different perspectives again. And that's the only place you could really start from. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to exacerbate the problem.
I mean, it's kind of scary that the answer is out there, but we're not taking that step to go there because it doesn't serve the algorithms or the amount of content that people are consuming, right?
Or the business model, essentially.
The business model. And speaking of business, we've talked a lot about how disinformation can impact society and individuals. How about some examples of how disinformation has impacted specific businesses?
There are so many examples, and they continue to get more creative, let's say. And you have everything from people impersonating executives. I think there's a really famous example from a Fortune 500 company in the US where the financial controller approved $25 million worth of transactions on the basis of a deep fake video with the CFO. So that's how good the technology has gotten, how difficult it is to identify these things. Even, for example, fake LinkedIn profiles from fake cybersecurity experts pretending to be part of the company and telling different members of a company to change certain settings on their laptops, which of course then they go ahead and do, and then they are subject to hacks. Even back in 2013, there was a very famous example where the Associated Press Twitter account got hacked, and a narrative was released that Obama had been injured in bombings in the White House. Literally $140 billion in US market revenue wiped off the books in a few hours, and the S&P 500 tanked. It of course rebounded later that day when everybody realized that it was actually a disinformation narrative. But these are the kinds of, it's everything from investor confidence, mergers and acquisitions, your ability to retain your customers. All of these things are deeply, deeply impacted by disinformation narratives.
That is bonkers. Let's switch from the problems, which obviously are scary, to solutions. I was doing a bit of reading around how the PR industry is responding to disinformation. And it ranges from everything from having some sort of verification on information and communications. And this is from the PRCA in America, a kind of a commitment or an oath, if you like, to only sharing accurate information. Are these going to solve a problem?
I think the very first question is define accurate information. What is that? And that ultimately is the challenge at hand. Because what is truth, what is not truth? How truthy is it? Is everything at the end of the day is perception in a lot of ways. So from my perspective, the challenge is not necessarily, is it fake, is it not fake, is it true, is it not true? We're living in a context where it almost doesn't matter. As strange as it might be to hear that, and as strange as it feels to say that. Because what matters is people's propensity to believe the narrative. And that's the bits that as an industry we're not necessarily focused on. We're incredibly focused on the content itself, on whether it's fake, is it going viral, what's the damage it's doing, what content metrics has it hit, what's the emotionality of the piece of content, but we're not focused on people. And people at the end of the day are both the problem and the solution. We are the ones who see these narratives and act on the basis of it. We're the ones who share them. We're the ones who take action. And so what's essential as an industry to understand is, especially when you're working with certain clients who, let's say, are incredibly vulnerable to disinformation, is what are the groups of people that are actually relevant stakeholders that I need to buffer this client against? What would be the weak points at which I could potentially fail that I need to prepare for? But if a narrative is spreading, who's likely to spread it? And especially on the basis of what the narrative is and what the source is. So I think it's flipping the lens around, actually, to go from being so content-centric, which, of course, as an industry, we are, because we live, breathe content. It's probably why all of us got into this space to begin with, because it's so creative and so dynamic. But we really have to focus on the people side of it and how people are spreading and the propensity to believe.
So it kind of feels like the PR industry just isn't really hitting the mark here. Do you have an inkling for why that might be?
I think there's a few reasons for it. I think in a lot of contexts, we very much see our role and reason for existence in the world as almost being a sort of more in the kind of content brand space than in being a resilience builder. And we actually, as an industry, both in public affairs and in PR, are ultimately resilience builders for our clients, because what we're enabling them to do longer term is to be able to acquire new lines of business, to buffer them against all of these risks. And these risks are going to continue to get worse. So, and I can sort of reference my Edelman days, which have been sort of a bit long gone now. It was about 4 years ago that I left. But the focus was always on how we told the story, not necessarily who the story was for. We were very laser focused on the content itself and on the news channel, not necessarily focused as much on people. And part of that also is exacerbated, and I'll put my hand up as a technologist around this, by the data side of it. Because from the data side of it, especially social listening platforms, we're looking more at content performance metrics. It's easier for us to digest, as opposed to trying to look at the layers of human beings and what makes a narrative resonate with us at all and what makes us believe something. And so I think that's something that I would love to see in the PR industry at some point shift, which is starting to kind of reframe how we think about what's essential for us to do to be able to buffer our clients longer term, as opposed to specifically, let's say, how much can we get content to spread, which certainly in the US, I will say is more the issue than it is in the UK and the rest of the EU.
So it kind of feels like we need to be rethinking the whole model of what PR is and our tools and our skill set. We don't have an awful lot of time left, but I am going to come to questions in a second. So I'm going to wrap up a few questions into one, which is, give us an example of who's doing it well, just so we have a bit of a North Star to aim for.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an agency called Influence, which is based out of the Netherlands, a small but very mighty boutique firm. And I think they kind of reframe, they would never say they're a PR firm, but they very much see their sort of reason for existence in the world as being able to influence different groups of people. And that kind of takes us away from that model of let's put as much content in real time across performance marketing platforms to as many people as possible in that one-to-one match, and kind of what the focus has been for a long time, and much more the subtle art of how do I connect with someone and get them to move, which again puts one in the position of who is and what is the group of people I'm trying to influence to begin with, and how can I actually get them there. So at Boon, we've actually worked with them quite closely over time to look at how we can actually achieve that effect for them.
Cool. Before we go to questions, if the audience would just take a few things away, like 3 things away from this conversation, what would you like them to take away?
Oh, that is a big question. I'm going to start actually with what happened over the weekend in the Unite the Kingdom protest. And I think it's a very important event for us to reflect on, because what we would absolutely be missing the point on is not taking the opportunity to try and understand why those people were out there protesting to begin with. It would be very easy to sit here and dismiss them as crazy, as racist, as narrow-minded, as uneducated. But this is the moment for us as communicators to try and get under the hood a little bit more and to try and understand what is really motivating them to be there at all. And that then gives us the tools to be able to start to communicate and to ultimately to attempt to build a bridge, which we desperately, desperately need in society right now. So my very first takeaway would be to emphasize the need for human centricity. And it's really bloody hard, especially in this current ecosystem, because it is so personal, it's so identity-based. Often those narratives are attacking our own identities, our own values. And we have to try and transcend that now, to try and see the other, to meet them where they're at, and to hopefully come back to the middle. And only human centricity will enable that in the end. It's the understanding the why. And that's when we can start to build campaigns around it. I think the second thing I would really hope one takes away from this is that everyone in PR and public affairs is on the front lines of the information wars. Your role has never been more important, which also then means this is an incredible opportunity to reframe how you think about what you do and to sort of step into that role and to really see yourself as a resilience builder, not just for the clients you work for, but also within society. And I think the third takeaway I would like everyone to have is to really think in the art of the possible. Everything I have talked about for the last 25 minutes has probably been mildly terrifying, but or a little bit more than mildly terrifying. This is the moment to kind of step into the role of thinking in the art of the possible, of being creative, of challenging ourselves, of challenging our colleagues, to really get innovative in how we tackle these problems. And this is actually where tech can be your best friend. As much as we've talked about tech being a potential destabilizer, tech is a tool for you to get really creative and really effective. So And really wicked problems, which we are living in today, require really clever, creative solutions. So again, it's not all doom and gloom. I think I really would hope and ask and challenge everybody listening to this to really embody that art of the possible type of thinking, because that's when we can actually move the needle.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Questions? Oh, lots of hands going up.
First of all, thank you so much for amazing thoughts. And I recently completed my master's at London School of Economics, and I was writing the topic about how technologies respond to, how technology companies to respond to disinformation and propaganda, and during wartime, and with a focus on digital trust, epistemic security, and platform asymmetries. So, and I was wondering, I would like to ask you about, do you believe that the most effective future strategies against disinformation and propaganda primarily defensive strategy, or should democracy also consider offensive tactics? Thank you.
Absolutely both. I think the only way we're going to be, we first need to strengthen our levels of social cohesion. That has been very bitterly broken, especially in an American context, and especially after the shooting of Charlie Kirk. So that is some internal work that's required, that I would not consider that primarily defensive or offensive. It's purely rebuilding. But when it comes to thinking ahead and the types of narratives that we're likely to be attacked with from a range of different stakeholders or entities or actors or whomever it might be, whether it's a country or whether it's a company, absolutely you have to be on both the offensive and the defensive at the same time. There's a great example from a company in California that literally lost 25% of its revenue because a competitor posted 2 fake reviews on Google. 2. That's all it took. And what that actually signaled in a lot of ways is that they hadn't spent enough time building their brand equity, building a loyal base that could actually then sort of show up and support that company in that sort of moment of need. So being offensive and defensive are actually 2 sides of the same coin. And we just need to make sure we think in that sort of 360 kind of way.
Hi, my name's Sabina. I'm from Sec Newgate UK. I listened with interest what you just said about us as communicators and as public affairs professionals, and I'm actually one of the latter, that we are more important than ever before. I think we have all acknowledged that communications and political communications or political influencing or lobbying or whatever you want to call it, they're really two sides of the same coin. They do work very integratedly together. But I have 2 questions, and now that the technological dimension comes into that as well, is number 1, how do we help people understand how important we are? And how do we do that by showing rather than just telling and trying to raise our prices and hope people pay for them? But also in a world where there are places that have got maybe a chief communications officer, maybe a chief technological officer, but not a chief political affairs officer, how do you help organizations integrate, or what advice would you have for them on that elevation point, but also working those 3 dimensions together?
It's a great question, because again, coming from that world as well, that's always something that you're kind of in a dance with customers around in terms of what the value is that you bring to the table. And I think in the end, the most effective way is to show effect, fundamentally, is to show up in a meeting and show them something and a way of thinking and even data that they haven't seen before, and that gives them an entirely new insight into how to tackle the problem. It's taking somebody's frame of reference on the customer side from here to out here. So, and broadening their perspective in terms of how they can actually tackle a problem. And I think it's the diversification of options that is incredibly useful, especially in the current context that we're in. It's almost enabling them to be Swiss Army knives in a way, and to really be able to think outside the box. And I think that's something that's, I see a lot of opportunity still, especially in the public affairs space, to be able to bring that for clients, and certainly never more important than now. So I think it's how one shows up and can kind of help them tackle those problems, solutioning with them, sort of workshopping those potential solutions with them and kind of going into that more consultative process with them, and then effectiveness in the end. I hope that answers your question, since it was sort of a multidimensional one. But
Thank you very much, Anjali.
Thank you so much. I mean, I have to say, I had goosebumps honestly throughout almost the entire session. Anjali for Prime Minister, as far as I'm concerned right now. But listen, I think a really key message is that people keep worrying about AI, but the relationship aspect of what we do has never been more important, and we are on the front line where it comes to disinformation. So we have a massive opportunity. So please do reflect on this, and obviously keen as many people as possible hear that message. And I'd just like to say a huge thank you. I thought that was an incredibly powerful session. So thank you both. Thanks again.